Chapter 1: The Girl from Quarrymill, in which our heroine is introduced. Yennefer Fall grinned wryly as she held the spade in her hand, twirling it idly as she examined the task before her. In her mind's eye, she could imagine the irrigation ditch as it would be, upturned soil giving way to a stream of cool water. The work would not be easy, and it would take both her and her dozen fellow diggers the better part of a week to finish, but no one could deny how vital it was to complete. Crops needed water, clothes needed to be bathed, and children needed to play. There was something comforting about the nature of the work to the Highlander here. To Yen, it made all the difference in the world that what she was doing mattered, that she was making a difference. The spring heat that had settled over the lush forest that was the Twelve's Wood seemed to abate, as did the occasional bite of insects and the growing blisters on her hands. At 72 ilms, or 6 fulm even, Yennefer was tall even by Highlander standards. Her boyish features were weathered by sweat and years of hard work, but remained resolutely cheerful in her demeanor. Her mud-brown eyes were the same color as her hair, though much of that had been dyed into a deep rust red. Only the tips of her bangs showed their true color, jutting out from under her short-cut and messy bun. Hair dye was one of the very few luxuries she afforded to herself, a monthly ritual that she partook in by candlelight. There simply wasn't enough gil to go around to have anything more. It was a miracle that she was able to stay fed most days, a fate she shared with every other Alamegan in the hamlet of Quarrymill. Yen gripped her spade in both her hands before dramatically plunging it into the damp soil. "All right," she chirped eagerly. "Let's get to it." Her fellow laborers glared at her, their enthusiasm far more muted than that of the girl of 21 summers. Even if they had shared her jubilance, Yen was far from being their leader. That position was claimed by a great bear of a man named Mefrid. Mefrid was easily twice Yennefer's age and had all the scars to prove it. Also a Highlander, his skin was tanned and weathered by a life long lost in the homeland. There was a great tragedy to the old warrior, this former hero of Alamigo reduced to digging a trench in a country not his own. Yen could remember spending many an evening as a child, begging him to tell his stories of the city-state, tales of beautiful red sands and heroes striding upon them. Those days seemed so very distant now. Mefrid's jaw set as he stared out into the depths of the Black Shroud. The vast forest had an equally vast number of names. His eyes silently surveying the shadowed undergrowth. "We should get this done quickly," he said in a low voice. Who knows how many eyes we're attracting? Yennefer cocked her head. "You're not worried about the crow claws, are you?" Mefrid turned his head to look straight at her, his expression unchanging. "Just because we're not wood whalers doesn't mean we're not targets." He turned back to resume staring into the woods. "The whole forest is desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things." Yen frowned. What would anyone gain from robbing us? His position felt wrong in a way she couldn't express, but even so she was struggling to refute it. Mefrid sighed deeply. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes staring at her, through her, in a way that made her feel suddenly very cold. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears as Mefrid's 1,000 yalm stare saw ghosts she couldn't imagine. "You haven't seen what I've seen, Yen," he said sadly. The dig had become deathly silent. All of the other laborers were watching them with rapt attention, waiting to see what would be said next. Yen blinked. She looked down. "Maybe not," she muttered. She chewed at her lip anxiously, unsure what to say. "But it doesn't have to be that way, does it?" As Yennefer dug through the day, her only thought was the silence that was Mefrid's reply. Night fell slowly in the spring, but it shrouded the forest in black once it did finally arrive. Yen had always supposed that was where the shroud's name had come from. The clearing in the forest that Quarrymill occupied was faintly illuminated by a ring of torches placed high, along the settlement's palisade wall. Beyond that seemed to be an abyss, entirely impassable to the eye. Inside the walls, the torches and lanterns kept the grounds warmly lit. Not all areas were so well blanketed in light, though. In the darkest corner of the hamlet, a single long cabin rested. The bunkhouse had been built some 20 years ago, but with the amount of wear on it, it'd be easy to mistake it for 200 years old. Repairs were oftentimes literally patchwork, desperate measures to keep the only home the Alamegan refugees had from crumbling. From one end of the structure to another were cots, with only a few fulm of personal space to separate them. It was communal living in its most literal sense. Children ran about the aisles, making the most of their days of play, while the elders did what they could to aid the able-bodied. Food cooked just outside the bunkhouse was brought in, meager portions passed around as far as it could stretch. These last few weeks had been bad ones, worse than they'd been in a long time. The groans of the starving were ample enough evidence of that. Life had gotten harder for the hamlet as a whole, though no one could agree about why. Trade had slowed, and the number of attacks, animals, bandits, or worse, had gone up. As difficulties forced austerity for the Gridanian settlers, things became doubly threadbare for the Alamegans. It had been bad enough to have the merchants not look you in the eye when they ripped you off. Now they just didn't sell you anything at all. Yen had collapsed into her cot the moment the day's work had concluded. She couldn't tell if her hands or her back were more sore, though at least blisters would become calluses soon enough. The laborers had made good headway, but the task was still far from complete. Tomorrow would be a repeat of today, more backbreaking labor under the sun, more suspicious watching of the tree line, more scorn from Gridanians passing by. The refugees did not belong here, and were reminded of it, often. Yen stared up, her eyes fixed on a single, small hole in the roofwork revealing the stars beyond. The twinkling dots against the black canvas of the night sky felt so coldly distant, like they were silent judges. Despite being in a building full of people, Yennefer felt so terribly alone. Her heart roiled in her chest as Mefford's words echoed in her mind. You haven't seen what I've seen. There had been an indescribable sadness in his eyes when he spoke, like he had seen into the future and already knew each of their fates. What had he seen about hers? Yen thought about her unanswered question. Did it have to be like this? Did they need to struggle, destitute and uncertain, vainly hoping that some Gridanian would take pity? That the wood whalers, the much vaunted protectors of those who called the Twelveswood home, would lift so much as a finger to defend people that they wished, sometimes quietly, but often not, would disappear? Yennefer curled inwards on her cot, into a fetal position. Her heart was sinking, her eyes misting. She knew the answer. She had known it for a long, long time, and had dreaded it to her core. It didn't have to be this way, but the only way for things to get better was for someone to act, to go outside, to come back stronger, prepared to protect them in a way that no one else could, that no one else would. That someone, she realized with a rush of 1,000 swirling emotions, would have to be her. By the terrible weight of both youth and a hope that had yet to be crushed, it had to be her. Her hope, her life, her dream, her prayer, that leaving behind everything she had ever known would, somehow, create a better tomorrow. Yen had to leave Quarrymill.